Sometimes what saves us doesn't arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes it begins as a whisper so faint you could mistake it for the wind. The sun was dipping low over the Oregon hills that evening, the kind of soft amber light that turns every blade of grass into gold. The forest edge behind Margaret's old cedar barn glowed like a memory, still quiet, except for the occasional sigh of wind threading through the tall weeds. Lila Carter had come to this place to breathe again. It had been months since her mother's passing, and the city with its noise, its fast rhythm, its endless reminders of everything she'd lost had become unbearable. So when her grandmother invited her to spend a few weeks at the family cabin, Lila said yes, hoping the distance might untangle what grief had knotted inside her. She had spent the morning cleaning dust from the shelves and finding old photographs tucked in the pages of books. By late afternoon, she stepped outside, needing to stretch her legs. The air was cool, scented with pine and rain-soaked soil. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called the sound sharp and lonely, the way certain memories are. That's when she heard it. A sound so thin she almost didn't. It wasn't a bird, not quite. More like a sigh wrapped in fear. She stopped walking, listened again. There, beneath the whisper of tall grass, a faint broken cry. At first, she thought it might be a rabbit caught in the fence or a stray kitten from the neighbor's barn. She moved closer, parting the wild weeds with careful hands. The cry came again, and there, hidden in a patch of flattened grass, was the smallest creature she'd ever seen. A bobcat kitten. His fur was matted damp with mud and dew. The tiny black tufts on his ears quivered in the breeze. He was trembling, not the restless kind of shaking you see in play, but the deep kind that comes from hunger and cold. Lila froze, heart beating hard in her chest. She'd seen pictures before bobcats were wild rare this close to human homes, but this one was just a baby, a heartbeat in a body too small to survive the night. She knelt slowly, the denim of her jeans brushing against the wet grass. The kitten's eyes blinked open, startling blue, fierce, yet frightened. He tried to hiss, but the sound came out weak, almost apologetic. Lila whispered, "Hey there, little one. It's okay." Her voice cracked a little on the word okay. There was no mother in sight, no sound of movement in the trees, just stillness, that kind of silence the woods keep when they're holding their breath. She waited long enough for the shadows to shift, long enough to give nature its chance. But nothing came. And in that quiet space between caution and compassion, she made a choice. She took off her flannel scarf, the one that still carried the faint scent of her mother's lavender detergent, and gently wrapped it around the kitten. He squirmed weakly at first, then went still, eyes fluttering, closed body melting into the warmth like he'd been waiting for it. When she lifted him, she could feel how light he was. Too light, like the weight of air and hope combined. She tucked him close to her chest beneath her jacket. His small heartbeat thudded against her ribs, quick and fragile, the sound of life fighting to stay. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it was. Every step she whispered something under her breath. Little nothings, little promises. You're safe now. You'll be warm soon. At the porch, her grandmother looked up from a basket of yarn, brow furrowed at the sight. Lila hesitated at the door. He was alone out there, Grandma. I couldn't just leave him. Margaret set her knitting aside, her eyes soft but knowing. Let's get him warm first. Then we'll figure out what the right thing looks like. That was always her way, calm, steady, the kind of woman who believed in doing right by both heart and reason. Inside, the air smelled of chamomile and wood smoke. Margaret filled a bowl with warm water while Lila fetched an old towel from the linen chest. Together, they worked quietly, no panic, no chatter. Just two sets of careful hands and one small life between them. Lila dabbed at the mud, her touch slow, deliberate. The kitten's tiny ribs rose and fell under her fingertips. Each time he twitched, she whispered, "You're all right." Margaret returned with a hot water bottle wrapped in cloth and placed it near the box where they'd laid the kitten. "He'll need warmth first," she said gently, "then milk. But not cow's milk that'll hurt him." Lila nodded, grateful for the steadiness of those words. She didn't realize how tense she'd been until that moment. Margaret smiled, faintly, eyes glancing toward the window where the last light of day slipped through. "You know," she said softly, "your grandfather once brought home a hawk with a broken wing. It bit him 3 times before it ever let him feed it, but he said it was worth every scratch." The story settled in the room like a lullaby. When the kitten finally drifted into sleep, his small head resting against the wool blanket, Lila sat beside the stove, knees pulled close. She couldn't stop staring at him. Something was humbling about that tiny spotted creature curled in her scarf. Something pure, not just fragile, but real. Maybe it was because in his helplessness she saw her own reflection. The way grief had stripped her bare, left her small and trembling, unsure of what came next. The healing mirror, though she couldn't have named it then, was already there between them. Outside, the night gathered. The trees swayed in slow rhythm, whispering secrets only they understood. Inside, the sound of breathing filled the space, hers, Margaret's, and the kitten's. 3 heartbeats, 3 different rhythms, somehow sinking into one. She thought of the wild, of how nature doesn't cling, how it gives and takes with a kind of quiet faith. Maybe that's what she needed to learn how to hold without keeping. For now, though, she was just grateful for the small warmth of another living thing. Later, when Margaret had gone to bed, Lila stayed up, sitting near the stove. The fire cracked softly. She could hear the rain beginning again, tapping on the roof like a slow metronome. The kitten stirred in his box, stretching one paw into the air before settling again. Lila smiled. "You've got spirit," she whispered. "I think I'll call you Rowan." The name came from a memory. Her mother's favorite tree, the rowan that grew behind their old house, said to protect travelers and guide lost souls home. It felt right. As she watched him sleep, something inside her softened, not healed, not yet, but loosened enough for air to move through. Grief had been a heavy, locked room. But this was a crack of light under the door. She wondered if love in its simplest form might be just this, noticing the smallest life and choosing to care. The world outside that cabin was still uncertain, filled with sharp edges and unfinished goodbyes. But inside, for one night, there was only warmth and breath and the steady rhythm of possibility. We often talk about rescuing animals, but sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the wild finds us when we've forgotten how to listen. And in the hush between one heartbeat and the next, it teaches us how to begin again. Because kindness isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet one. The kind that starts with a small decision, a small act, and ripples outward like the sound of wind in the grass. As dawn approached, the rain faded into mist. Lila dozed in the rocking chair, the kitten nestled beside her hand. When the first light brushed across the cabin floor, she opened her eyes to see him watching her, bright-eyed, now curious, alive. Margaret's voice floated from the kitchen. "Well, looks like someone's decided to stay a while." And in that moment, with the scent of coffee and pine filling the air, Lila realized that this wasn't just a rescue. It was a beginning. But beginnings, as her grandmother would later remind her, are promises we must learn how to keep. And so the journey of care, and the question of what care really means, began. If you've ever held something fragile in your hands and felt it hold you right back, share this story with someone who believes that kindness, no matter how small, still changes the world. Some homes don't speak in words. They speak in the soft crackle of a fire, in the hush between 2 heartbeats, and in the way one small life finds comfort in the crook of your hand. The cabin woke slowly that morning. Rain had rinsed the world clean, and through the window came the pale shimmer of Oregon light, that soft silver glow that blurs the edges of everything it touches. In the corner by the old wood stove, a small box lined with a wool blanket began to move. A tiny yawn, a stretch of paw, and then a squeaky sound, not quite a meow, not quite a growl. Rowan was awake. Lila leaned forward, her breath catching when she saw those blue eyes blink open. For a moment, he looked at her, a little dazed, a little suspicious, before he gave the smallest flick of his ear and burrowed deeper into the blanket. The heat from the stove had painted the air golden. Margaret was already in the kitchen, her robe tied neatly, humming some tune that had no words, just the melody of a long life lived with steadiness. She glanced toward the corner and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "looks like our guest made it through the night." Lila nodded, her heart warming. "I didn't think he would," she admitted. "He was so cold, Grandma." Margaret poured tea, her movements unhurried. "Cold doesn't always mean the end, sweetheart. Sometimes it just means the world is waiting for a little warmth to return." That day unfolded gently, like pages turned in an old book. Lila called the local feed store, explaining in careful words that she had found an orphaned bobcat kitten and needed something safe to feed him. The man on the phone didn't sound surprised, just kind. "We've had a few calls like that this season," he said. "Come by. I'll set aside some formula and a dropper." Lila slipped on her boots, her scarf still smelling faintly of smoke and lavender, and made the drive into town. When she returned, Margaret had placed a chair by the stove ready for her. "Let's see if our little traveler's hungry," she said. The first few tries didn't go well. Rowan turned his head, jaw tight, tiny teeth bared in defiance. He didn't trust the plastic dropper or the strange hands that held it, but hunger has its own quiet persuasion. After a few minutes of patience and stillness, he sniffed the tip again. Then tentatively, he licked. One drop became two. Two became a rhythm, slow, deliberate, the sound of survival finding its footing again. Margaret smiled, eyes soft. "There you go, little wild one. You've got the heart of a fighter." And Lila, sitting there with the kitten nestled against a folded towel on her lap, felt something new bloom in her chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, deeper, a fragile joy. When the feeding was done, Margaret rinsed the bottle and set it on the counter. She spoke like she was telling a story, half to herself. "You know, your grandfather used to say the hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was a promise that everything brought in from the cold would have a chance to begin again." Lila traced a finger along the rim of her mug. "Did he ever bring animals home too?" "Oh, always." Margaret laughed softly. "Once a fawn that had been caught in a fence. Once a goose with a broken wing. And once my favorite, a raccoon who kept stealing from the garden. He built her a little crate by the door so she could come and go." And did she? She did, every night, for a while. Then one morning the crate was empty. Margaret looked toward the window, her smile touched with something wistful. "That's how you know you've done it right." The day passed in simple rhythms, feeding, cleaning, resting. Outside the forest dripped with rain. Inside the cabin glowed with the amber of firelight. Rowan explored his box, batting at the folds of the blanket with paws too large for his body. He made small sounds. Curious chirps, half purrs, the language of something half wild and half comforted. Lila watched from her chair, her sketchbook open on her knees. She drew him with quick, gentle lines, the curve of his back, the spot above his eye that looked like a teardrop. And as she drew, she realized she was breathing easier. Her chest didn't feel so heavy. Maybe it was the sound of the stove. Maybe it was the rhythm of caring for something smaller than herself. But more than that, it was the feeling that purpose had quietly slipped back into her hands. There are moments in life when the act of caring becomes its own medicine. You start by trying to save something else, and without realizing it, you begin to save yourself. That morning, as Lila rocked gently in the chair, she remembered what it felt like to nurture, to create comfort instead of chasing it. Rowan's purr filled the space, not the delicate hum of a house cat, but a raw, engine-deep vibration that seemed to rise from his toes. The sound made the air tremble. It was the kind of sound that went straight to the soul. Not polished, not domesticated, just pure, unfiltered contentment. Margaret chuckled from her corner. "He purrs like he means it." Lila smiled, brushing a stray tuft of fur from his back. "I think he does." As evening fell, they set another small fire. The room dimmed into golds and browns. The world outside, rain trees, wine blurred into a soft chorus. Rowan slept curled in his box, one paw twitching in a dream. Margaret pulled out an old quilt and draped it over Lila's shoulders. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence was full, not empty. Lila thought of her mother, then the way she used to hum while cooking, how she'd light a candle in the kitchen window on stormy nights. That memory, once sharp with pain, now felt tender, almost luminous. It struck her how love doesn't end, it just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a scarf wrapped around a wild kitten. Sometimes a soft bed near a fire. Sometimes just the courage to open your hands again. The hearth, she realized, wasn't about fire at all. It was about belonging a small circle of light that says you're safe here for now. And maybe that's what humans and animals share most deeply. Not language, not logic, but that longing for warmth, for gentleness, for a place to rest. The language of the wild isn't always a roar or a cry. Sometimes it's a sigh in your lap, a trust that's given, not demanded. Rowan's presence reminded her that care and control are not the same thing. To care is to give what's needed, not what's easy. And the greatest kindness often asks us to prepare for goodbye, even as we cherish the hello. Margaret seemed to sense her thoughts. "You know," she said softly, "animals don't stay because we need them. They stay because for a while they choose to." Lila nodded. "Then I'll just try to be worth staying for." Later that night, the wind shifted. It came down from the mountains, rattling the trees, scattering pine needles across the porch. Lila stirred awake to the sound of the storm. She checked the box. Rowan was fine, sleeping deeply, his tiny chest rising and falling like a metronome. She pulled her blanket tighter and sat near the stove, watching the flames dance. In that small, flickering light, the cabin felt like its own world, one made of compassion, patience, and the quiet strength of women who knew how to keep both life and love alive. She realized she wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. It didn't remind her of loss, it reminded her of possibility. Outside, the world could rage. But inside, here in this circle of warmth, something sacred was unfolding, the beginning of trust between two very different kinds of souls. And perhaps that's the secret gift of moments like these. They teach us that healing isn't about noise or certainty. It's about small acts repeated with care. A dropper of milk, a folded blanket, a whisper into the dark that says you're safe now. By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, falling across the floorboards in thin gold ribbons. Rowan stirred, stretching with an awkward grace. Lila reached out, and he didn't flinch this time. He leaned into her touch. And in that single motion, simple, instinctive, pure, the cabin seemed to exhale. Margaret smiled, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Well," she said, "I think the wild has decided to trust us, at least for today." Lila looked down at the tiny creature nestled against her palm and whispered, "Then I'll do my best to deserve it." Outside, the woods shimmered under a new sun, and deep within them, the call of wildness waited, patient, ancient, inevitable. But that was a story for another day. If this moment touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that warmth still has the power to change the world. One small act of kindness at a time. Some silences don't need to be broken. Some are meant to be filled not with words, but with the quiet, steady hum of love finding its rhythm. By the end of that week, the cabin had found a new kind of heartbeat. It came not from the clock on the mantel or the creak of old floorboards, but from a small box near the fire where a once frozen life now purred like a tiny motor of joy. Each morning, when the light slanted through the lace curtains, Lila would wake to the sound of it. That deep, rolling purr, unrestrained, unapologetic, alive. At first, she thought it was unusual for such a small creature to make such a big sound. But Margaret only smiled. "That's no ordinary kitten," she said. "That's a bobcat. They don't whisper their happiness, they roar it." And she was right. The days took on a gentle shape. Feedings became less frantic. The bottle gave way to a shallow dish and a mix of formula and soft meat. Rowan learned quickly. He'd pour at the bowl's smudge milk on his whiskers, then lick his paw in a clumsy circle of satisfaction. He followed Lila everywhere, from the porch to the edge of the garden, where she hung sheets to dry, to the chair by the window where she sketched the mountains. When she sat, he'd leap into her lap, circle twice, and collapse a warm, spotted bundle of fur and trust. The first time he did it, she froze, afraid to move. But he didn't care. He stretched, sighed, and began to purr with such abandon that the whole chair seemed to vibrate beneath her. It wasn't the delicate hum of a house cat. It was something wilder, deeper, as if the forest itself was breathing through him. Margaret, knitting nearby, looked up and said quietly, "He's telling you he feels safe." Lila nodded, not trusting her voice. That evening, as rain traced lines down the window pane, Lila sat in her favorite chair. The room smelled of cedar smoke and warm wool. Rowan, now a little sturdier, had climbed into her lap again. She reached out, rubbing behind his ears, feeling the vibration of his purr rise through her hands. It wasn't just sound, it was sensation. The kind that travels straight to the chest and stays there. He tilted his head, pressing his nose against her wrist. His eyes were half closed, his breath slow, content. It struck her then how something so wild, so untamed by nature, could find peace in such a small human gesture. And maybe she thought that was what connection really was. Not ownership, not control, but shared stillness. She looked down at him and whispered, "You're safe here, I promise." The fire answered with a soft crackle. The days that followed blurred together like a dream that didn't want to end. There was something sacred in the repetition, feeding, cleaning, resting, listening. Healing had a rhythm. And Lila began to understand it wasn't just Rowan who was learning to trust again. Every time he purred, it was like he was lending her a piece of calm she didn't know she was missing. That steady sound filled the quiet places her grief used to echo through. She realized she hadn't cried in days. Not because the sadness had disappeared, but because it had softened, turned into something bearable like mist after rain. Rowan became her daily prayer, not in words, but in presence. She didn't have to explain herself to him. He didn't ask her to be strong or cheerful. He just was. And in his being, he gave her permission to just be too. One afternoon, Margaret found them on the porch, Lila sketching Rowan sprawled across her lap, paws twitching in sleep. The older woman paused, watching them for a long moment. "You know," she said softly, "you two remind me of each other." Lila smiled faintly. "How so?" "You both lost something. You both found warmth again. The only difference is he doesn't fight it." The words lingered. Lila glanced down at Rowan, his fur rising and falling with each breath, his small claws resting gently against her jeans. He had surrendered to safety, not because it was given, but because he'd chosen it. And she realized she'd been holding her own comfort at arm's length, afraid to feel it too deeply in case it vanished again. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Maybe healing isn't about forgetting the wild parts of yourself. Maybe it's about learning where to rest them." As summer edged closer, the forest around the cabin began to hum with new life. The creeks ran louder, the evenings longer. Sometimes, when the air was cool and the stars just starting to appear, Lila would take Rowan outside to the porch. She'd set him down gently, and he'd pad across the worn boards, nose lifted to the wind. The woods were alive with sound crickets, frogs, the distant call of a barred owl. And somewhere in that vast orchestra, Rowan seemed to find his note. He'd stand there tiny and fearless, as if listening to something only he could hear. Lila watched him with quiet awe. There was no leash, no cage, just trust. And as he turned to look back at her eyes glinting in the starlight, she felt something close to reverence. The wild wasn't something to conquer or tame. It was something to honor both in him and in herself. In the days that followed, their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through small consistencies, shared silence, familiar rituals, patience. The world outside still spun with noise and distraction. But inside that cabin, there was a calm that felt almost ancient. Lila began to understand that love isn't about making something yours. It's about standing still long enough for trust to grow in its own time. And in that stillness, she also rediscovered her own heartbeat, slower, steadier, more aligned with the rhythm of life around her. It was as if nature, through this tiny creature, was teaching her the language of peace again. The language of the wild, she realized, isn't learned in words. It's learned in listening to rustling leaves, to soft breaths, to the space between what we say and what we mean. Margaret often reminded her, the hardest part about caring for something wild is remembering that love has boundaries. You give them safety, not captivity, guidance, not control. She spoke from experience. She once nursed a wounded fox that had limped onto their property years ago. When it was time to let it go, she said the silence afterward was the truest test of love. Lila listened, her hands resting on Rowan's back. She understood the words, even if her heart wasn't ready to face them yet. For now, she told herself there was time. Time to love, time to prepare, time to learn. Every evening as dusk fell, Rowan would climb into her lap again. His fur smelled faintly of pine and warmth. His purr filled the quiet like a familiar song. Margaret would sit by the fire, knitting in rhythm with the sound. And in that harmony, the clicking of needles, the purr, the crackle of flame, the cabin felt alive. It was a home made not of walls, but of care. And though neither woman said it aloud, they both knew it couldn't last forever. Still, they chose to stay in that moment fully, gratefully, completely, because that's what love does. It teaches us to hold joy even when we know it will one day ask to be set free. One night, just as Lila was drifting to sleep, she heard a new sound, not from inside the cabin, but from outside. A low, distant cry, wild, echoing through the trees. Rowan's ears twitched. He lifted his head, eyes wide, listening. It wasn't fear she saw in him, but recognition. A pull, subtle but undeniable, the call of where he came from. She reached out, her fingers brushing his back. He looked at her, then back at the window, torn between two worlds. Margaret's voice floated softly from her room. "Don't worry, sweetheart. The wild always calls when it's ready. Our job is just to make sure they're strong enough to answer." Lila sat in the quiet that followed her heart, full of both peace and ache. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, Rowan curled against her once more. But in his purr, she heard something new, a note of restlessness, of awakening. If you've ever known a bond that changed the way you see the world, one that taught you more about love, trust, or letting go, share this story with someone who believes that the wild and the human heart still speak the same quiet language. There comes a moment in every love story, quiet, unannounced, when the heart must ask itself, is keeping something close the same as keeping it safe? Spring had softened into summer by the time Rowan's paws outgrew the box by the fire. The once delicate kitten had become sleek and strong, his spots darker, now his eyes turned from baby blue to burnished gold. He no longer tripped over his own feet or sought constant warmth. Instead, he prowled. He explored the porch, the garden, the woods just beyond the fence line, each step a little bolder than the last. And though Lila told herself she was proud, she also felt something else. Something quieter, something heavier. It was the ache of change, the kind that sneaks in when you realize the thing you love most no longer needs you in the same way. Love has its own wild instinct. It wants to hold on. It wants to keep safe, to shelter, to freeze time. But the truth, the one every parent, every caretaker, every soul who has ever nurtured another must face, is that love isn't meant to cage. It's meant to strengthen so that freedom is possible. Margaret had said it early on, but Lila hadn't really understood. Not until the day Rowan refused to come inside. It was a bright morning, the air heavy with the scent of wildflowers. Lila had just finished her online coursework and stepped onto the porch, expecting to find Rowan curled in his favorite spot by the door. But the porch was empty. She called his name softly. "Rowan." From the edge of the clearing came a rustle, and then there he was, crouched low, eyes locked on a butterfly dancing just above the grass. For several seconds he was motionless, every muscle taut with focus. Then with a powerful spring, he leapt high, graceful, unstoppable. The butterfly escaped, but the moment shimmered with life. Pure, untamed, joyous life. Lila clapped, softly smiling, until she realized he hadn't come back when she called again. "Rowan, come on?" She tried once more, voice careful, coaxing. He looked at her. Not defiant, just distant. Then he turned and trotted toward the line of trees disappearing into green. Her heart stuttered. She ran to the edge of the woods, calling again the way one might call for a child wandering too far from home. No sound came back but the hum of cicadas. Margaret's hand landed gently on her shoulder. "He'll come back," she said quietly, "when he's ready." Lila nodded, but her throat felt tight. What if he gets hurt?" Margaret's gaze drifted to the tree line, thoughtful. "The forest teaches its own lessons, love. He needs them now more than he needs us." The words landed softly, but they hurt anyway. That night, Lila sat by the window listening for any sign, a rustle, a call, a shadow. Her heart raced every minute he was gone. When he finally returned hours later, his fur damp from the grass, his eyes alive with some secret wonder she couldn't share, she wanted to scold him. Instead, she just knelt, whispered, "You scared me," and pressed her forehead against his. He purred, that deep, resonant purr that had first filled the silence months ago. But it sounded different now, fuller, older, less dependent. She realized she wasn't comforting him anymore. He was comforting her. And that realization cracked something open inside her, a truth she'd been resisting. That all this time she hadn't just been rescuing a wild creature. She'd been trying to rescue herself from the emptiness of loss. Rowan had become her proof that love could still heal. But now, love was asking her to let that healing take its next shape, one that didn't cling. The next morning, Margaret was on the porch feeding breadcrumbs to a pair of doves that had built a nest in the eaves. Lila joined her, the mug of coffee warm in her hands. "You ever wish the things you love didn't have to change?" she asked quietly. Margaret's smile was gentle. "Oh, every day. But then I remember if they didn't change, neither would we." Lila nodded, eyes following the doves as they fluttered away. Margaret set down the bowl. "When your grandfather and I first moved here, we took in a fox kit that had lost its mother. It stayed a whole summer. But when fall came, it left. I cried for a week." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "And then one winter morning, I saw it again, standing at the tree line. It didn't come close, just looked at me. That was enough. Sometimes love's reward isn't keeping, it's remembering." Lila let the words sink in. The forest rustled around them, full of unseen life. It dawned on her that Margaret wasn't just talking about the fox, she was talking about every love that has to learn to loosen its grip. That afternoon, they sat down at the kitchen table, laptop open, reading about wildlife rehabilitation. The words were factual, practical rules about diet, socialization, and eventual release. But beneath the science was something spiritual. Every act of care must point back toward freedom. That was the covenant between humans and nature, between heart and instinct. Margaret leaned back at her eyes, thoughtful. "We're doing right by him, you know, giving him the tools to survive out there." Lila sighed. "I know. I just wish I didn't have to lose him to do it." Margaret reached for her hand. "That's not losing, dear. That's the truest kind of love, the kind that wants what's best, not what's easiest." Later that evening, Lila sat by the fire again. Rowan stretched out on her lap. Heavier now, his coat rich with color. He rolled onto his back, his favorite position, belly exposed, paws half curled. She rubbed gently, and he purred, loud as ever. But even as she smiled, she noticed his gaze flicking toward the window, where the last light of day glimmered through the trees. He was already listening to another call. She swallowed hard, whispering, "Not yet." He blinked slowly, as if to say, "Soon." The purr filled the silence again, deep, steady, but threaded now with the faint rhythm of farewell. Love changes tone long before it changes shape. It starts in laughter, settles into comfort, and eventually matures into the quiet courage of letting go. For weeks, she'd measured her days by his needs, feedings, cleaning, playtime. But now, she began to see that the true measure of her care would be how ready he was to live without her. It wasn't a loss. It was a graduation, his and hers. Outside, summer deepened. The wildflowers gave way to tall grasses. The nights grew full of crickets. Each sound was a reminder that life moves forward, whether we're ready or not. She felt the forest breathing, patient, ancient, inevitable. And somewhere within that rhythm, she began to make peace with the truth. Love that stays gentle will always find its way back in some form. That night the moon hung low, pale and round. The air carried the smell of cedar and warm earth. Margaret had gone to bed, but Lila stayed awake, sitting near the window with Rowan asleep at her feet. She watched the trees sway, the shadows shifting like ocean waves. For the first time, she didn't see them as something that might take him away. She saw them as something that might carry him home. Maybe faith isn't about believing things will stay. Maybe it's trusting that what's real never truly leaves. She whispered a small prayer, not for keeping, but for safety. "For wherever you go, little one. For wherever I have to let you go." The wind stirred gently, as if in answer. The next morning, the world looked different. Not brighter exactly, just clearer. Lila understood now that every act of care had always been building toward this. Each meal, each stroke, each long evening spent beside the fire, all were lessons in how to love without possession. And when she looked at Rowan, stretching in the sunlight, she didn't feel the same fear anymore. She felt gratitude. He was proof that kindness, when freely given, doesn't vanish, it multiplies. That every life touched by gentleness becomes part of a greater circle, one that never truly closes. Margaret smiled when she saw the change in her granddaughter's face. "You're ready," she said quietly. Lila didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes shining. That evening, as the sky turned violet and the forest hummed with night, Lila opened the porch door and let it stay open a little longer than usual. Rowan stepped to the threshold, pausing. He looked back once, tail flicking, then padded onto the grass. He didn't go far, just enough to feel the world waiting for him. Margaret's voice, soft behind her, said, "When he goes, it won't be the end. You'll see him again. Maybe not here, but you'll know." Lila stood in the doorway, arms folded, heart steady. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'll know." The stars came out one by one, and in their quiet shimmer, she found comfort. If you've ever had to let go of something you loved, not because you wanted to, but because it was the kindest thing you could do, share this story with someone who understands that love at its best is freedom in disguise. Some goodbyes don't come with words. They arrive on the wind, a whisper through the trees, a sound that feels like memory calling you home. The summer had stretched long and kind across the Oregon Valley. By August, the fields shimmered with heat and the wild edge of the forest grew thick with green. Inside the cabin, everything had settled into its familiar rhythm. Coffee in the morning, the hum of cicadas by noon, and the soft thump of Rowan's paws on the porch boards as the day faded. He had grown strong, confident. His muscles were sleek under the spotted coat that caught the light like moving water. He no longer tripped when he leapt. He no longer needed the safety of her lap. But even as he thrived, something had changed in him, something Lila couldn't name at first. He'd sit by the window for long stretches, ears flicking toward sounds she couldn't hear. When the wind came down from the mountain, his body would go still, as if listening to a voice she wasn't meant to understand. That's when she realized the wild was calling him back. It wasn't sudden, the way distance begins. It's a slow, almost invisible drift, one paw step at a time. He still purred when she brushed his coat, still followed her into the garden and slept by the stove on cooler nights. But his eyes, once fixed on her every move, had turned outward, toward the tree line, toward freedom. She tried to ignore it, telling herself he just needed space to explore. But love has a way of sensing the inevitable before the mind can admit it. And so each evening she'd catch herself listening, not for the sound of his purr, but for what came after. The quiet that lingered. The kind that feels like something ending even as it keeps going. One night after a day of heavy rain, the air was thick with the smell of wet cedar and soil. Margaret had gone to bed early, her book still open on the side table. Lila sat near the window, sketchbook forgotten in her lap. Rowan was perched on the sill, his silhouette framed by the dark. The forest beyond was alive with sound crickets, owls, the low hush of wind moving through leaves. But there was something else that night, faint and wild. A distant cry, high-pitched and strange. Rowan's ears twitched, his body stiffened. He let out a soft growl, not of anger, but of recognition. Lila whispered, "What is it, boy?" He didn't turn toward her. He just watched the darkness muscles trembling with some instinct older than any human bond. Then, before she could stop him, he jumped down and padded to the door. He looked back once, a glance that seemed to hold both question and goodbye. And then he was gone, slipping into the night as if the forest had opened a secret door just for him. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Lila stood frozen. Her breath caught somewhere between fear and acceptance. The wind pushed gently against the window, rattling it like a reminder. She whispered, "Please come back." The waiting that night felt endless. Every sound outside a branch, breaking a gust of air, felt like a heartbeat she was trying to interpret. Margaret found her sitting there when the first light came. "You didn't sleep." Lila shook her head. "He's out there." Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements steady, knowing. The forest has its own kind of grace, love. Sometimes you just have to trust it. Lila looked out the window again. "I want to," she said quietly. "But it's hard when you can't see the ending." Her grandmother smiled faintly. "Endings aren't meant to be seen, dear. They're meant to be felt, like seasons changing, like the sound that fades when the wind shifts." Those words lingered, and as the sun broke through the clouds, Lila realized that the ache she felt wasn't only fear. It was love learning a new shape. There's a moment every caretaker faces when love collides with instinct. You've built safety, but nature asks for release. You've given warmth, but the wild needs its cold mornings too. And this is the paradox. What feels like abandonment is sometimes the purest act of loyalty. Lila had read about this in her research on wildlife rehabilitation, how human affection must eventually give way to wild instinct. The goal isn't to keep, it's to return. But knowing something in your head doesn't make it easier on your heart. She thought of her mother, then how she used to say, "You can't keep a songbird in your hand. You'll only crush the music trying to stop it from flying." That night, as Lila sat on the porch, she finally understood. Love's deepest form isn't holding tight. It's opening your hand even when it trembles. The days that followed moved in soft, uncertain rhythms. Rowan came and went like a tide. Sometimes he'd appear in the mornings, padding across the porch with dew on his paws, eyes bright, body lean from running. Other days he'd stay away. No sound, no sign, only the faint prints left in the damp soil near the edge of the woods. The forest seemed to watch her, too. The pines whispered overhead. The crows gathered in pairs, calling out across the valley. It was as if nature itself was aware of the small drama unfolding at its border, a love story between worlds. One evening after a brief storm, she saw him again. He stood just beyond the fence, half shadow, half sunlight. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he gave a small, throaty sound, a low purr that rolled through the dusk like an answer to every fear she'd ever had. And just as quietly as he'd come, he turned back into the trees. Lila didn't cry. Instead, she smiled, a slow, trembling smile, because she understood what that sound meant. He wasn't lost. He was becoming. A few days later, a white truck pulled into the gravel drive. The logo on the side read, "Oregon Wildlife Rehabilitation Unit, Officer Grant." The same ranger Margaret had called months ago stepped out, clipboard in hand. "I've been checking on your report," he said kindly. "Bobcat sightings nearby." "Probably your boy." Lila nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's been back a few times." Grant smiled. "That's a good sign. Means he's learning to hunt on his own." He paused, then added gently, "It's hard, I know. But you've done right by him. Not many would have." When he left, Margaret came to stand beside her on the porch. "You see," she said softly, "even the wild knows gratitude. It just doesn't speak it in words." Lila leaned against the railing, the wind lifting her hair. "He's out there somewhere," she whispered. "And that's enough." That night the sky was clear, the stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Lila sat on the porch steps, the sound of the forest stretching around her, vast, alive, eternal. She realized something then. The call she'd been hearing wasn't just for him. It was for her, too. A call to trust, to live, to keep loving even when the story changes shape. The wild, it seemed, didn't take what you loved. It simply reminded you where love came from, a place too big to ever belong to one heart alone. She looked up at the sky and smiled, whispering into the night, "Be free." And somewhere in the darkness, far but near enough to feel a single purr, answered her. In the days that followed, she began to find comfort in the rhythms of the natural world again. The morning dew on the porch rail, the scent of pine needles after rain, the way sunlight moved through the trees, never in a straight line, always shifting, always forgiving. Faith, she realized, wasn't always about believing in miracles. Sometimes it was about believing in cycles, the endless, quiet turning of loss into renewal. And though the cabin felt emptier now, it didn't feel lonely. The warmth she had given still lived there in memory, an echo in air. Because love once real never truly leaves a place. It just changes. Its voice becomes birdsong, becomes wind, becomes everything you can't quite name but always recognize. Weeks pass. The forest began to hint at autumn leaves curling at the edges, mornings crisp with promise. One evening, Margaret was shelling peas by the window when she called softly, "Lila, come look." There, at the edge of the field, a figure stood larger, now powerful, his coat gleaming in the sunset. Rowan. He didn't come closer, didn't linger. He simply turned his head, met her gaze across the distance, and then with quiet grace slipped back into the trees. Lila didn't move for a long time. She didn't need to. That look was enough. And in that small, wordless exchange, she understood love had come full circle. If this moment touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that real love for animals, for nature, for life itself, doesn't end when we let go. It simply finds its way home. Sometimes what we love comes back not to stay, but to show us that letting go was never the end. Just another way for love to keep moving. Autumn had arrived softly in Oregon. Mornings came cooler, now touched by mist. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and apples ripening in the orchard beyond the hill. Leaves that once whispered green now rustled in shades of copper and gold, falling slow as old memories. For the first time in months, the cabin felt still. No sound of small paws on the porch, no scratch at the door. Just the wind, a constant companion, gentle but reminding. Lila had settled into the rhythm of that quiet. She tended the garden, joined Margaret in the kitchen, walked the forest trails that used to echo with a spotted shadow beside her. Some days she found Trace's paw prints by the stream feathers, caught in bramble, a patch of fur on a low branch. Signs that he was there somewhere. Alive, free, and that was enough. Most days. But on the nights when the wind came from the east, carrying the scent of pine and something wilder, she found herself standing by the window again, looking out into the dark. Not waiting, just remembering. Grief has a way of softening when we start to see love not as absence but as presence in a different form. It becomes a quiet companion, not heavy, not demanding, just a gentle reminder of what mattered most. That was what Rowan had become for Lila. A reminder that love doesn't disappear when it leaves your arms. It only changes its shape from the warmth of fur beneath your hand to the stillness of a forest that now feels alive every time you walk through it. It's strange how silence can hold so much company once your heart learns how to listen. It happened near the end of October, just as the sun began to sink behind the ridge. Margaret was on the porch, a wool shawl around her shoulders, peeling apples for cider. Lila was sweeping the last of the fallen leaves when Margaret's voice broke the hush. "Lila, look." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of awe that makes the world slow down. Lila turned. At first, she saw only the field golden and quiet, the long grass bending under the weight of twilight. Then she saw him. At the far edge of the meadow where the land met the forest, a figure stood proud, still unmistakable. A bobcat, full-grown, now his coat shining bronze in the dying light. Her breath caught. For a long moment, neither moved. The distance between them might have been 50 yards, but it felt like none at all. He was beautiful, strong, whole, everything she had hoped for. Her heart swelled and ached all at once. She wanted to call his name, but no sound came. Instead, she simply watched, and he watched back. And in that silence, something passed between them. Something wordless, but complete. Recognition. Gratitude. Homecoming. Then, as gently as he'd appeared, he turned one last glance. Golden eyes catching the last of the sun and melted back into the trees. The grass swayed where he'd stood, the air still trembling with what had just been. Margaret laid a hand on Lila's shoulder. "You see," she whispered, "he's all right. You gave him that." Lila nodded, unable to speak. Her eyes burned, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. It's strange how joy and sorrow can share the same heartbeat. One doesn't erase the other, they simply sit together, learning to breathe in the same rhythm. In that moment, watching Rowan disappear into the wild, Lila felt the ache of separation and the deep peace of knowing she had done right both at once. She realized that the bond they shared had never depended on closeness. It was built on trust. Trust that warmth would linger even when touch was gone. Trust that love, once given freely, always finds its way back, even if only in the form of a gaze across a field. That night, she wrote in her journal, "He came back, not to stay, but to remind me that some promises are kept in silence." In the days that followed, everything felt subtly changed, as though the world had exhaled. The light in the kitchen seemed softer. The woods no longer felt like they were keeping secrets. And Lila, for the first time, walked through them without fear of what she might not find. Because now she knew. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow, every pulse of the wind, all of it carried the same quiet message. He was out there, alive, free. And that freedom didn't mean separation. It meant fulfillment for him and for her. The echo of return wasn't about seeing him again. It was about feeling his presence woven into everything that remained. Love, she realized, is less about possession than resonance. It doesn't need to be near to be known. It only needs to be true. Later that week, Officer Grant stopped by again. He had news from the Rehabilitation Network sightings of a healthy young bobcat thriving in the nearby reserve. "Could be your boy," he said, smiling. "They tend to stay near familiar ground, especially if they were raised with care." Lila's chest tightened, but in a good way. "That's good," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted." Grant nodded. "That's the best outcome there is. You didn't just save a life, you restored it to where it belongs." After he left, Lila stood on the porch, watching the tree line sway in the afternoon wind. She whispered to the forest, "You keep him safe, okay?" And though no answer came, a hawk cried overhead, sharp, bright, and free. And somehow that was enough. That evening, as dusk settled, Lila and Margaret sat by the window sipping cider in silence. Outside, the sky blushed pink and gold, the horizon fading into the kind of twilight that feels like forgiveness. Margaret spoke softly. "You know, your grandfather used to say every act of care sends a prayer into the world. Not the kind that asks for something, the kind that gives thanks for what already is." Lila smiled. "Then I guess Rowan is our prayer come full circle." Margaret nodded. "The world needs more of those." The fire crackled softly. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted slow, steady, ancient. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt completely at peace. It wasn't just the story of a wild animal anymore. It was the story of two hearts learning the same lesson in different languages, one in fur and instinct, the other in memory and grace. Rowan had taught her what her grief never could, that healing isn't about returning to what was. It's about becoming what's next. And sometimes, the greatest measure of love isn't how tightly we hold on, but how gently we release. The next morning, the world looked new again. The sky clear, the air cool and bright with promise. Lila stepped outside, barefoot on the dewy grass. A few red leaves clung to the rowan tree they'd planted months ago, its branches small but determined. She reached out, brushing her fingers over one of the leaves. It shimmered in the light like a heartbeat made visible. And there she made a quiet vow, not of possession, but of purpose. That she would keep helping creatures like Rowan, that the care she gave would continue long after the wild had moved beyond her reach. When she turned back toward the house, the morning sun caught the window, and for a second she saw her own reflection overlap with the forest beyond. It felt like a sign that the line between what's human and what's wild isn't a wall. It's a bridge, and compassion is what lets us cross it. Later that day, she found herself on the phone with the Wildlife Sanctuary, 2 towns over. They were looking for volunteers to help care for orphaned animals through the winter. Lila smiled, fingers tracing the grain of the old wooden table. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to help." Margaret, listening from the doorway, smiled the kind of smile that said everything without a word. The next chapter, it seemed, had already begun. If this moment touched your heart, share it with someone who believes love doesn't end when we let go, it only finds new ways to return. Sometimes as a glance, sometimes as a breeze, sometimes as the quiet, knowing that what you gave the world is still out there living beautifully. Some stories don't end when the door closes or the forest swallows a shadow. They live on in the hands that keep helping, in the hearts that keep choosing kindness again and again. The first frost arrived quietly that year. One morning, Lila stepped onto the porch and found the world brushed in silver. The air smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and somewhere in the trees, a jay scolded the cold with its sharp, defiant cry. She pulled her sweater tighter and smiled. The season had turned, and so had she. Rowan's return, that brief shining moment in the field, had shifted something deep within her so gently she hadn't noticed at first. But in the weeks that followed, it became impossible to ignore. The ache she'd carried for months had softened into something steadier purpose. Sometimes love begins as rescue. Sometimes it grows into responsibility, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it becomes a way of life. That's what was happening to Lila now. She still missed Rowan, of course. Some evenings, she'd catch herself glancing toward the tree line as she poured tea, half expecting the familiar shape to appear. But instead of sadness, what filled her was a kind of gratitude, like the echo of a song that no longer hurt to remember. Margaret saw the change before Lila did. "You're quieter these days," she said one morning over coffee. "But it's a good kind of quiet." Lila smiled. "I think I just know what I'm supposed to do next." It started with a phone call. The local wildlife sanctuary, the one Officer Grant had mentioned, was looking for volunteers to help with their winter rehabilitation program. They needed extra hands, feeding fawns, tending to injured birds, and cleaning enclosures. Lila hesitated for only a moment before saying yes. Her first day was cold and bright. She wore the same flannel scarf she'd wrapped around Rowan months ago, the threads frayed now, but still carrying that faint scent of smoke and memory. When she arrived, the air was alive with soundhawks crying overhead, the rustle of cages being cleaned, the soft chatter of caretakers swapping stories. A young intern showed her how to mix the formula for an orphaned raccoon kit. The tiny creature squirmed in her hands, eyes wide, heartbeat frantic. Lila smiled. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice instinctively soft. Steady, the same tone she'd once used with a certain bobcat kitten. The raccoon calmed tiny paws, curling around the bottle. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. The hearth isn't just for warmth. It's a promise. Here, surrounded by crates and straw and the smell of hay, she felt that promise taking on new life. Something is healing about caring for what can't thank you. You learn to find meaning in the act itself, the rhythm of feeding, cleaning, restoring. It's slow work, sometimes, messy, often unnoticed. But it teaches patience in the truest form, giving without needing to keep. Each time Lila cleaned a cage or released a small bird back into the open air, she felt a ripple of that same quiet joy she'd felt when Rowan first purred in her lap. She realized now that kindness wasn't meant to be a single moment. It was meant to multiply. Rowan had taught her that the wild, teaching the human how to live more gently. One afternoon, Margaret visited the sanctuary. She brought a basket of muffins and the kind of presents that made every space feel like home. The volunteers gathered around her as she spoke about the farm's long history, how her husband had once built nesting boxes for barn owls, how every winter they'd leave food out for migrating deer. She told them, "You don't have to change the whole world, just the small piece you can reach. Nature takes care of the rest." Her voice was calm, her eyes bright with pride. And in that moment, Lila saw the thread that connected them all the same, compassion just passed down like a lantern, lighting one heart at a time. Later, as they drove back to the cabin, Margaret looked out at the hills glowing orange in the late sun. "You know," she said softly, "Rowan didn't just find you, dear. He found the part of you that was always meant for this." Lila squeezed her grandmother's hand. "Then I guess I'll keep doing what he started." By December, Lila had become part of the sanctuary's daily rhythm. She learned to recognize the calls of each bird, the moods of every animal. She was no longer the girl searching for something to heal. She had become the healer herself. And yet in the still moments between chores, she sometimes thought of that quiet field, the glint of golden eyes across the distance. The memory didn't make her sad anymore. It made her steady. Rowan had been her teacher, the mirror that reflected not her loss, but her capacity to love fully, bravely, without expectation. And she carried that lesson into every gentle act when she released a hawk and watched it take flight, when she comforted an injured deer trembling with fear, when she walked home through the woods and heard the wind moving like a whisper of gratitude. Winter nights came early. The moon rose huge and pale above the trees, casting silver shadows across the snow. Inside the cabin glowed with lamplight. Margaret sat by the fire, knitting, while Lila wrote in her journal at the kitchen table. She wrote not about sadness anymore, but about wonder. The wonder of small lives intertwined with her own. The wonder of how love keeps finding new forms to take. She thought about faith, not the kind that comes from words, but from trust. Trust that every act of compassion plants something in the world that grows beyond sight. Outside, a fox trotted across the frozen yard, its breath visible in the moonlight. Lila watched it pause, nose lifted toward the wind. Then it disappeared into the forest. She smiled. Somewhere out there, Rowan's descendants might be roaming those same woods. And if that was true, then love once released really did ripple outward forever. Lila's work at the sanctuary taught her truths that stayed close to the heart, that kindness and knowledge belong together, that compassion needs boundaries as much as it needs courage, that caring for the wild means respecting its freedom. She learned to talk to visitors who came curious and left thoughtful, sharing what she knew about bobcats, about habitat loss, about the importance of letting wild things remain wild. But she never lectured. She just told stories about a kitten found in the weeds, about the promise made beside a fire, about the day love walked back into the forest and never truly left. People listened, some cried, a few decided to volunteer. And that's how legacy works. It doesn't shout. It whispers until someone new decides to listen. In late winter, Margaret fell ill for a time. The days were short, the fire low. Lila spent her evenings reading aloud from her grandmother's favorite book. Her voice steady, her heart full of quiet gratitude for all they'd shared. One evening, Margaret reached for her hand. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. When I'm gone, don't stop telling these stories. The world forgets too quickly. Remind them that gentleness still matters." Lila nodded, tears shining in the firelight. "I promise." Margaret smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's my girl. That's how we keep the wild alive." When spring finally returned, the rowan tree outside the cabin budded for the first time. Tiny red shoots pushing through frost, fragile but determined. Lila stood beside it, her hands resting on the soil. It struck her how life always insists on beginning again, no matter how many times it's asked to start over. That, she realized, was the true legacy, not the keeping, not even the remembering, but the continuing. Every small act of care, every whispered story, every seed planted in faith, they were all part of the same conversation between the human heart and the wild it loves. A few weeks later, she received a letter from the sanctuary director. They wanted to offer her a permanent position, a coordinator's role, helping train new volunteers and manage animal releases. Lila read the letter twice, her pulse quiet but strong. She looked out the window toward the tree-lined sunlight spilling through the branches like a benediction. In her heart, she felt it clearly, the same call that once belonged to Rowan had become her own. She smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll do it." Margaret's photograph on the mantel caught the light just then, and for a moment the room felt full of warmth, of presence, of unseen gratitude. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes that kindness is more than a moment. It's a legacy, a promise that keeps the world gentle, one caring act at a time. Every life we touch leaves an imprint not on the skin but somewhere deeper where memory turns into meaning. And even when our hands are empty, the lap still remembers the warmth. The spring sun slanted through the cabin window, painting the floorboards in soft ribbons of light. Outside, the forest was waking up again, snow melting in slow silver streams, birds stitching their songs through the morning air. The world was new once more, as it always manages to be. Inside, Lila sat by the fire, notebook in her lap. The sanctuary schedule lay open beside her, a mug of tea cooling nearby. It had been nearly a year since Rowan's return, that moment in the field when wildness looked her in the eye and said thank you without words. She still thought about it sometimes, but now the thought carried peace instead of ache. His absence was no longer a wound but a kind of echo, gentle enduring a hum that lived beneath her every act of kindness. There was a rhythm to her days now. Morning drives to the sanctuary. Evenings spent reading under the same lamplight that once flickered against a box by the fire. Nights filled with the steady sound of the forest breathing outside her window. It was, she often thought, a quiet kind of happiness, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but leaves the soul feeling full. Love changes form but never direction. It moves outward from one act to another, from one heart to the next, until what began as rescue becomes something larger than either side could hold. That's what had happened here. A frightened bobcat kitten needed a home. A grieving young woman had needed a reason to open hers again. And in finding each other, they'd created something that kept growing, a legacy of care, of patience, of understanding between the human and the wild. The lap that once held a trembling creature now held planned sketches and ideas for new enclosures and educational programs. Lila had learned that nurturing doesn't end when the moment does. It expands like the ripples of a drop falling into still water. Margaret often said, "We don't get to keep what we love, but we do get to become it." And that, Lila realized, was exactly what she'd done. One afternoon in early May, she stood in the sanctuary meadow as a young bobcat, one rescued from a roadside ditch months earlier, was being released back into the wild. The small group of volunteers gathered quietly as the crate door opened. For a long second, the animal hesitated. Then, with a powerful leap, it ran into the tall grass, disappearing into sunlight and motion. Everyone clapped softly. Lila didn't. She simply smiled, her eyes bright, her heart steady. The moment replayed something inside her, not sadness, but recognition. She'd been here before, in a different season, with a different heartbeat. That sense of déjà vu felt sacred, a circle closing where another would soon begin. Later that evening, as the sky deepened to a watercolor blue, she sat on the porch steps with a blanket draped around her shoulders. She looked out toward the line of trees, the same horizon that had once held her farewell. The breeze carried the scent of pine and blooming clover. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped a sound that might have been nothing. Or maybe everything. She closed her eyes and smiled. "Good luck out there," she whispered. Not to the one who'd just been released, but to all the lives still waiting to be found. The heart keeps its own kind of map. It remembers the places where it learned courage, the hands it held, the moments it released. Lila often thought about that, about how love, when lived fully, leaves behind something almost physical, a pulse that lingers in spaces long after the story has ended. Her lap, once home to a frightened wild kitten, still felt that echo sometimes, like a phantom warmth, a gentle weight of memory. She'd catch herself reaching down, half expecting to feel fur under her palm. And when she didn't, she'd just smile. Because what she carried now didn't need to be touched to be real. She had learned what true connection was: not ownership, not permanence, but participation in something bigger. Kindness, she discovered, isn't about what we keep, it's about what we give back to the world. And each time she taught that to someone new, a volunteer, a visitor, a child staring in wonder at a rescued fox, she felt Rowan there. Not as a ghost, but as a quiet presence woven into her every act of care. In her journal, she once wrote, "We are all rescuers in one way or another. We rescue memories, stray moments of grace, bits of hope that the world drops when it rushes too fast. We pick them up, hold them, and send them back out again." That's what she believed now, that every act of compassion, no matter how small, is a seed. Some seeds grow into trees, some into trust, and some, like hers, grow into a lifelong calling. Margaret often said that nature was the original teacher of faith. Watching the seasons turn, you learn that nothing truly disappears. It just changes form, waiting to bloom again in its own time. So when the wind moved through the rowan tree outside the cabin, the one planted in that first spring after Rowan's rescue, Lila always paused to listen. The leaves rustled softly, as if telling stories back to her of wildness, of courage, of the gentle kind of love that never asks for return. Sometimes she'd whisper back, "I remember," because she did. One evening, as twilight brushed the hills, she found herself sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watching fireflies blink across the meadow. The world around her hummed with quiet life frogs, calling the distant ripple of a creek, the low sigh of the woods settling for the night. And in that hush, she felt something holy. Not the kind tied to churches or prayers, but the kind that lives in gratitude itself. She thought about how life is made of small, fleeting miracles, a wild creature choosing to trust a hand, reaching out a purr that fills the silence. She thought about her mother, about Margaret, about Rowan, about every soul, human or animal, that had crossed her path and left a piece of light behind. And she understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means finding something more powerful to carry alongside it: purpose, tenderness, grace. That night, before going inside, she looked up at the stars, endless, constant, ancient, and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered to everything that had brought her here. To the cry that started it all, hidden in the weeds, to the hands that held her steady, to the wild that called him home. Because sometimes a story doesn't end with goodbye. Sometimes it ends with the sound of wind through the trees and the quiet, knowing that what was once small and trembling has found its place in the vastness. And that somewhere deep in those woods, a bobcat moves like a whisper of memory, strong, free, unafraid. We all have our own Rowan. Someone or something that reminded us that love still exists in a world that often forgets it. Maybe it was a stray dog you fed. Maybe it was a friend who showed up when you least expected. Maybe it was a moment when you looked around and realized you'd survived what you thought you couldn't. Those moments matter. They're what make the world feel human again. And in each act of kindness, no matter how small, there's a bit of the same wild magic that filled that little farmhouse. Trust, hope, love, loyalty, emotion. The kind that heals quietly, the kind that lasts. Before turning in, Lila set her empty cup on the railing. The night was still. The rowan tree swayed in the gentle breeze, its leaves glowing faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere an owl called once and was answered from afar, a conversation across distance like two hearts that had never really stopped listening. Lila smiled, placing a hand over her heart. "Good night," she whispered. Inside, the fire had gone to embers, the room bathed in soft orange glow. She settled into the armchair, her grandmother's quilt draped across her knees. And though her lap was empty now, it still remembered the weight, the warmth, the purr that had once filled it with life. That memory, that love, had become her compass, pointing her back to what truly matters, giving warmth wherever the world feels cold. If this story touched your heart, take a quiet moment tonight to think about the lives, human or animal, that have shaped you. Think about what you've learned from them and how you might pass that kindness forward. And if you'd like to help more wild creatures find their way home like our little bobcat did, consider leaving a super thanks or donating to support wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. Your kindness can help another frightened heartbeat find warmth again. And before you go, remember to like this video, subscribe for more gentle, soulful stories, and join this community of hearts that still believe compassion can change the world.